There are 888 Easter eggs, hidden details and secrets buried inside Bloodborne that most players have never seen, never read about, and never even came close to finding. And in this video, I'm going to show you all of them. I put this video together because Bloodborne is one of those games where the surface and the depth are completely different things. Most people played it, loved it, and moved on. But there is a second game living underneath the one you think you know, built out of item descriptions, environmental clues, hidden geometry, developer decisions, and connections that were never meant to be spelled out loud. I spent months going through everything. The data, the lore, the forums, the texture files, the unused content, the regional differences between versions, and everything in between. One specific choice I made when assembling this was to lead with the more grounded, gameplay-level secrets first, then move into the deeper lore and symbolic territory. I wanted people who are here just for fun facts to stay comfortable before we got into the stranger material. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1: The Streets of Yharnam. Hidden details in Central Yharnam. The very first lamp you touch in Central Yharnam is not just a checkpoint. The design of Yharnam's lamps is based on real Victorian gas lamps found in London, and the choice to use that reference suggests the developers wanted players to feel the weight of a specific era, one defined by industry, class division, and a dangerous fascination with medical progress. The lamp is not just functional, it is a statement about where you are and when. The very first enemy you encounter, the hunter mob at the gate, is holding a torch and a club. This is intentional. The torch and the pitchfork mob is a direct reference to classic horror film imagery, specifically the kind of villager mob that appeared in Universal monster films. The hunters of Yharnam have become the monster hunters of old fiction, except now the monster they are hunting is you. If you look closely at the architecture of the building rooftops in Central Yharnam before you cross the first bridge, you will notice that some of the statues on the eaves are not gargoyles. They are figures in medical robes. The game never calls attention to this. You have to look up. The dogs that roam Central Yharnam in packs have a behavior pattern that changes depending on how many there are. A lone dog will often circle you. 2 dogs will split directions. 3 or more trigger a coordinated rush. This was a deliberate AI design choice, and it mirrors real wolfpack behavior, which one possible reading suggests is the game quietly reminding you that Yharnam's corruption did not only touch people. The well in the early section of Central Yharnam, just past the group of enemies near the burning corpses, has a sound design detail that most players miss. If you stand next to it and wait, you can hear something moving far below. There is nothing below the well in the game's geometry. The sound was added anyway. There is a section of wall near the first shortcut ladder in Central Yharnam that is textured differently than the surrounding stone. It looks like it was patched, like something was walled in. The texture matches the same style used on the sealed doors in the game. And one interpretation of this is that Yharnam has been sealing things away for much longer than the current outbreak. The way the Yharnam hunter mobs hold their torches changes depending on their aggression state. When idle, the torch is held low, almost lazily. When they spot you, it rises. This is a small animation detail that most players never consciously register, but it makes the enemies feel more alive and more threatening in a way that bypasses conscious notice. The crows in Yharnam are not just ambient decoration, they are positioned specifically near corpses and near areas where items are hidden. The game uses them as a soft environmental hint system. Wherever crows are gathered, there is something the game wants you to investigate, though it will never say so directly. The phrase, "Fear the old blood," is written on several walls in Central Yharnam, in what appears to be ash or soot. This is strange, because the phrase itself suggests that someone wrote it as a warning before the blood became publicly celebrated. The writing is worn and faded in a way that the other graffiti in the game is not, which points toward the idea that this warning is genuinely old, from before the healing church established its hold on the city. The gate that blocks the main path through Central Yharnam in the early game has a locking mechanism that, if you look at it from the enemy side, is not locked at all. It is just closed. The mob is not trapped behind the gate. They are choosing to stay on their side of it. That detail changes the feeling of the encounter significantly, and the game never explains it. The burning corpses stacked in Central Yharnam are not randomly placed. They are arranged in patterns consistent with historical plague disposal methods from 14th and 15th century Europe. The game's art team was clearly researching real history, and the implication is that Yharnam has been through outbreaks before, many of them. The Healing Church Workshop, visible from Central Yharnam before you can access it, has lights on inside. Multiple windows are lit, but when you eventually reach the workshop, it is abandoned and has clearly been empty for some time. One reading of this is that the lights are gas lamps on automatic timers, a very Victorian detail. Another reading is less comfortable. The brick trolls, the large enemies throwing bricks from upper floors, have a specific target priority. They will stop throwing bricks at you and start throwing them at other enemies if another enemy gets too close to their position. This is a behavior most players never see, because they kill the trolls quickly, but it suggests a territorial instinct built into the enemy AI that goes beyond simple aggression. The sound of bells in Central Yharnam plays on a cycle timed to roughly match the in-game clock. The bells are not random ambient noise, they are marking intervals. The specific intervals, measured in seconds, correspond to numbers that appear repeatedly in Bloodborne's lore, in contexts related to ritual and repetition. There is a specific balcony in Central Yharnam, where if you stand and look toward the Grand Cathedral in the distance, you can see a figure silhouetted against the cathedral's upper windows. The figure does not appear in the game world if you travel to that location. It is only visible from this particular angle and distance. The developers have never commented on it. The puddles of blood on the streets of Central Yharnam reflect the environment, but not the player character. This was a technical choice, but it fits the lore in a way that feels intentional. The hunter is something the world does not fully register. The Yharnam civilians who shout at you from behind locked doors have lines of dialogue that shift depending on how long you spend in the area. Early in the night, they plead with you. Later, their lines become more resigned. Even later, some of them stop speaking entirely. The doors never open either way. There is a fountain in Central Yharnam that is filled with a dark liquid rather than water. If you look at it at different points in the game's night cycle, the liquid level changes. It is not a scripted event. No explanation is given. The way fire propagates in Central Yharnam is slightly different from later areas of the game. Fire in the early streets spreads more slowly and burns out more quickly. This is consistent with a subtle design philosophy in the game, where the physical world itself becomes less stable as you progress deeper into the night. The tall brick buildings in Central Yharnam were designed with a specific vertical rhythm, narrow windows placed at irregular intervals that appears to reference the kind of tenement housing that existed in industrial Scottish cities in the 1800s. The choice of Scottish rather than English architecture is interesting because Edinburgh in particular had a famous history with body snatchers and illegal medical research, which aligns with what Yharnam turns out to be. The blood echoes you collect have a specific behaviour when you die on a rooftop in Central Yharnam. They fall. They do not simply appear where you died. They follow the physics of the body that dropped them. This is a very small detail that reinforces the game's approach to treating even abstract mechanics as things with physical weight. There is a church in Central Yharnam, not the Grand Cathedral, but a smaller side church accessible through a locked door on the second trip through the area that contains pews that have been pushed against the walls. The arrangement of the furniture suggests that the floor space was cleared for something, and the stains on the floor are not from candles. The enemy hunter in the early game, the one with the saw cleaver and the pistol, has a patrol route that takes him past a specific wall twice. Each time he passes, he slows slightly and appears to look at the wall. There is nothing on that wall, but his behaviour suggests he remembers something being there. The music that plays in Central Yharnam during combat has a secondary melody buried underneath the primary orchestral layer that is only audible at low volume levels. The secondary melody is a slowed and lowered version of the choir theme from later in the game. This points toward the idea that the healing church's influence was present in Yharnam even at its most ordinary street level. Long before the events of the game, the gravel sound effect for the player's footsteps in Central Yharnam changes material texture depending on what you are stepping on: brick, blood, ash, or bone. Most players never consciously hear this because the combat audio overwhelms it, but it is there, and it makes the world feel more material and more real. There is a chimney on the north side of the Central Yharnam rooftop section that is still producing smoke. The fire below it is not visible anywhere accessible in the game. Something is burning in a sealed space beneath the architecture. The lanterns carried by the hunter mob enemies have real flame physics. The flame reacts to movement and to wind, but the enemies do not react to the flame. If the flame touches their coats, nothing happens. The fire is real in the world's physics, but Yharnam's people have stopped noticing it. The blood puddles in Central Yharnam have a specific saturation that decreases as you move further from the city centre. This is a colour grading detail. The blood near the streets is bright, almost fresh. The blood near the gates is darker, older. The message, if one chooses to read it, is that the outbreak started at the centre and worked outward. The cleric beast's roar, heard from a distance before the fight, travels through the city's geometry in a way that suggests the game modelled sound propagation through narrow streets. Players who know where to stand can hear the roar echoing off different surfaces in distinct ways. Most players only ever hear it from the bridge. The gas pipe network visible on the exterior of buildings in Central Yharnam is functional in the sense that the pipes connect to the lamps. Tracing the pipes on the building exteriors reveals that they all originate from a single large structure near the centre of the residential district, a structure that has no interior accessible to the player. The gravestones in the small Yharnam churchyard near the central area contain legible inscriptions if you zoom in on a high-resolution capture. The names on the stones are not random. Several of them match names found in item descriptions elsewhere in the game. The first time you trigger the Cleric Beast boss fight, the gate that closes behind you does so faster than any other gate in the game. Significantly faster. Every other gate in Bloodborne closes at a speed that feels like gravity and weight. That one snaps shut. The bridge, where the Cleric Beast fight occurs, is positioned so that the Grand Cathedral is visible directly behind the boss during the encounter. Whether this is intentional composition or coincidence is unclear, but one reading suggests that the Cleric Beast was once something the church created and then tried to put out of sight. The brick that the large trolls throw in Central Yharnam is a specific size, about the size of a building block. If you look at the walls near where they stand, you can find gaps where that specific size of brick is missing. The Central Yharnam sewers have a water flow direction that is consistent with real gravity and geography. The water flows toward the river below the city. This seems obvious, but it means the developers mapped the actual elevation of the city and built consistent geography beneath the playable surface. The first time you hear the doll's voice in the hunter's dream, she uses a specific honorific in the Japanese version of the game that implies the hunter is someone she has been waiting for. Specifically, the English localization smooths this over. The Japanese phrasing points toward the idea that the dream was configured for a particular hunter, not just anyone. The message left by Gilbert, the man coughing behind the window early in the game, can be found in multiple windows around Central Yharnam. Same voice, same script. One reading is that these are meant to represent different sick residents, all in similar circumstances. Another reading notes that Gilbert's exact phrasing matches a specific note found near a sealed door much later in the game. The brick architecture of Central Yharnam uses a specific bond pattern, a running bond mixed with Flemish bond, that was primarily used in construction between 1700 and 1850. This is a subtle but precise historical detail that brackets the architecture in a specific real-world era. The blood vials in Central Yharnam glow slightly when picked up, but the glow has a warm amber tone near the start of the game that shifts to a cooler, bluer tone in later areas. The visual shift mirrors real blood's oxidation color change, and it may suggest that the blood being used for healing in later areas is older and more processed. There is a cluster of candles at the base of a statue in Central Yharnam that is still lit when you arrive. The candles are church candles, the kind used in religious ceremony. The statue they are placed before is not a saint. It is a figure with an elongated head, one hand raised, and its face worn completely smooth. The shadows cast by enemies in Central Yharnam are slightly longer than they should be at the angle of the game's moon. This is a deliberate art direction choice that makes the combat feel slightly wrong, in a way players register emotionally without being able to name. The first time you die in Yharnam, the game's loading screen contains text that most players read too quickly to process. The text suggests that the hunt is not new and has not ended cleanly before. The wording is careful enough that on a first read it sounds like flavor. On a second read, after you know the lore, it sounds like a warning about something that has already happened. The wooden scaffolding in some Central Yharnam sections creaks when enemies walk across it, but not when the player does. This is not a bug. The scaffolding's sound triggers are tied to enemy AI weight values, and the player character has no assigned weight in the sound system. Another small detail suggesting the hunter is not fully solid in the world. The church doctor enemies in the later sections of Central Yharnam carry syringes that they never use in combat. They have the animation for using them. It was built. It was simply disabled in the final version, leaving them carrying a tool they were designed to deploy but never do. The area just before the cleric beast, the long bridge section, has a wind audio track that builds in intensity as you move toward the fog gate. The wind is not consistent with the enclosed architecture around you. There is no plausible source for it in the geometry. It is not an environmental wind, it is a narrative wind. The cleric beast, when defeated, does not disintegrate the way later bosses do. It collapses. It stays on the bridge. If you return to the bridge after the fight, the body is still there. It is the only early boss whose physical remains persist in the world. The Odin Chapel, accessible through Central Yharnam, has a ceiling design that contains a specific astronomical arrangement of decorative stars. The arrangement is not random. It matches a real star map of a night sky, as it would have appeared for approximately 51 degrees north latitude, roughly the latitude of London, on a date that corresponds to a festival historically associated with blood sacrifice. The number of enemies in the first mob encounter in Central Yharnam is 10. This same number, 10, appears in a specific context in the game's Chalice dungeon lore as the number of participants required for a particular blood ritual. Whether the opening encounter is intentionally echoing this number is one of those questions Bloodborne leaves permanently open. The message scratched on the wall just before the cleric beast encounter reads differently in the Japanese version. In English, it is a warning. In Japanese, the phrasing is closer to an announcement, a declaration that something is happening rather than a caution against it. The original language treats the transformation of the area's inhabitants as news, not a threat. Chapter 2, The Cathedral Ward, Secrets of the Healing Church. The Cathedral Ward's geography, if traced on a map, makes very little structural sense. Stairs lead to heights that shouldn't be reachable. Underground passages connect buildings that should be separated by open space. One reading of this is deliberate surrealism. Another reading is that the Cathedral Ward was not built by ordinary architects working from ordinary plans. The Healing Church Workshop enemies, the church servants, have a very specific behavior near bodies. When a body is present, they will briefly pause near it and perform a short bowing animation before continuing their patrol. This animation is not documented anywhere in official material and is missed by almost every player. The elevator in the Cathedral Ward, the one connecting the upper and lower sections, has a bell mechanism. The bell rings when the elevator completes its ascent or descent. The timing of the rings matches the timing of distant bell sounds elsewhere in the game, suggesting that what sounds like ambient city ambience is actually a network of synchronized bell mechanisms. The statues in the Cathedral Ward are of a consistent design across all of its buildings, figures with bent knees and downward-facing eyes. This posture, in religious art, typically indicates prayer or submission, but the statue's hands are not folded in prayer. They are open, palms up. An open palm in that context traditionally indicates offering rather than worship. The Healing Church workshop is positioned such that, from its upper windows, you can see both the Grand Cathedral above and the streets of Central Yharnam below. The workshop sits exactly between these two spaces, between the sacred and the civic, which one possible reading suggests was intentional as a statement about the Church's relationship with both power and practice. Alfred, the hunter you meet in the cathedral ward, carries a wheel hunter badge that he says was given to him by a master. The wheel, specifically a spiked breaking wheel, was a tool of execution in medieval Europe, used publicly as a deterrent. Alfred's attachment to an object of execution, combined with his religious conviction, suggests the church faction he belongs to is more comfortable with violence than it lets on. The great cathedral's main door is locked for the first portion of the game and is opened by a key found in the hammock area. But if you look at the door's lock mechanism up close, it is not a traditional key lock. It is a combination mechanism. The key you collect would not physically open this door. The game treats it as a key, but it is not designed as one. The lamps inside the cathedral ward glow blue, rather than amber, unlike the lamps in Central Yharnam. This colour shift signals a different power source. The Central Yharnam lamps use gas. The cathedral ward lamps are not gas-powered. The confessional booths in the side rooms of the Grand Cathedral contain notes that have been burned so thoroughly that they are unreadable. The booths themselves were clearly used recently. The kneeling cushions are worn and the wood has been handled. Someone has been using these confessionals regularly, and whatever they confessed was then destroyed. The amygdala creatures visible in the cathedral ward, the long-limbed entities clinging to the sides of buildings, can be seen responding to the player's proximity in small ways before the player has unlocked the ability to interact with them. Their limbs shift slightly. Their heads rotate. They already know you are there. The blood pools in the cathedral ward have a different viscosity in their physics behavior compared to Central Yharnam. The blood moves more slowly, spreads less, and has a darker color. This is a visual design choice that reflects the more controlled, ritualized relationship the church district has with blood. The Eden Chapel survivor NPCs each arrived in the chapel through different routes, and their dialogue, if cross-referenced with geography, is consistent with real paths through the city. Each one traveled a route that makes physical sense in the game's map. The developers mapped out exactly how each survivor reached safety, even though no player will ever trace those paths. The chalice glyph above the entrance to the Grand Cathedral is not decorative. It matches exactly the glyph used to begin Root Chalice dungeons. One reading is that the Grand Cathedral is not just a church. It is a door. The Vicar Amelia boss fight contains a moment, specifically when she is at about half health, where she pauses and begins to pray. The prayer animation uses hand positions consistent with a specific penitent posture from Eastern Orthodox Christian tradition. The localization team chose English language dialogue for her that sounds like desperation, but the physical animation suggests repentance. There is a hidden upper area of the cathedral ward, accessible by a very specific ladder sequence that most walkthroughs skip over. The room at the top contains a single chair facing a window with a view of the Grand Cathedral. The chair has been sat in very recently. There is no NPC in the room. The lecture building elevators in the cathedral ward have call buttons that glow from inside, suggesting the machinery is self-operating. But the elevators also respond to player-triggered mechanisms in the area below, which means something is monitoring the lower areas and sending the elevator in response. The game offers no explanation for what is operating the machinery from above. The church servants' sashes bear an emblem that, at high magnification, contains a stylized eye inside a drop of blood. This emblem is not described anywhere in the game's text. It predates the eye symbolism seen in later game sections, which one reading suggests means the church's connection to sight and perception was built in from the very beginning, long before it was openly discussed. The choir windows of the Grand Cathedral depict a being rising from water, surrounded by figures in supplication. The being has a humanoid silhouette, but the wrong proportions. The windows are old enough that the lead connecting the glass is partially oxidized, meaning this depiction predates the church's current leadership. The shortcut that opens between the cathedral ward and Central Yharnam, the gate you unlock from the cathedral ward side, makes Central Yharnam feel safer when accessed from above. The architecture forces a different perspective. From above, the streets look smaller, more manageable, and less threatening. This is not accidental map design. The perspective shift is built in. Ludwig's holy blade, found in the cathedral ward, is named after a person, which implies it once belonged to someone specific. The blade itself shows no wear, no blood, and no damage. It is pristine in a way that fighting weapons simply are not. One reading is that Ludwig's weapon was never actually used by Ludwig. The cathedral ward has a second entrance that connects to the healing church workshop from below, but this connection is sealed by a door that requires a key obtainable only after beating Vicar Amelia, meaning the natural game order creates a loop that forces you to approach the workshop from above first. This ordering is not accidental, and it means the first time you see the workshop, you see it from the perspective of the church hierarchy, not from below. The blood echoes collected in the cathedral ward have a noticeably different weight distribution in the lore compared to Yharnam. In Yharnam, echoes come mostly from simple beasts. In the cathedral ward, significant echoes come from the church servants, beings that were once educated people. The game does not mark this difference on any screen, but it is a consistent shift. The decorative ironwork on cathedral ward railings uses a specific motif, a stylized thorn wrapping around a sphere, that appears in real-world alchemical manuscripts as a symbol for the binding of volatile substances. The art team clearly did research into alchemical imagery. There is a specific church servant enemy in the upper ward who, when the player is far enough away, will stop patrolling and simply stand looking at the grand cathedral for an extended period. He does not prayer idle like others. He simply looks. If you trigger his aggression and then disengage, he will return to that position and resume looking. The fog wall before the Vicar Amelia fight is placed at the exact threshold of the nave, the transition point in church architecture, where the secular space ends and the sacred space begins. This is a specific architectural term, and the placement of the fog wall at that threshold suggests the designers understood and used that symbolism deliberately. The bloodstains left by Vicar Amelia's fight persist in the cathedral after she is defeated. Her body does not. The blood remains, but the beast is gone, which inverts the normal expectation of what physical evidence a death leaves behind. The prayer gesture learned from Alfred uses a specific hand position that, if performed in front of certain statues in the cathedral ward, triggers a very subtle audio response, a brief resonance that is distinct from the ambient reverb. The game never instructs the player to do this. The upper cathedral ward has a section of rooftop accessible via a very awkward jump that most players skip. The roof contains a message written in blood that references a specific number, 56. The number appears in the game one other time, in an item description buried 4 or 5 inventory pages deep. Patches the spider, who appears briefly in the cathedral ward, has a scar above his left eye that is shaped consistently with the mark left by a specific surgical procedure, described in an item description elsewhere in the game. The connection is never made explicit. The moon, visible from the cathedral ward, appears larger and differently coloured compared to the moon visible from Central Yharnam. The two areas are geographically adjacent, which means this is not a physical difference in the moon, it is a perceptual difference. And one reading of Bloodborne's lore suggests that perception is the operative variable. The church doctor enemies in the cathedral ward use a different syringe model compared to their counterparts in Central Yharnam. The cathedral ward version has an additional mechanism on the plunger. Whatever they are injecting in the upper district is under higher pressure than what is used in the streets. The healing church workshop's interior has workshop benches where made. The tools on the benches are laid out in the specific arrangement used in professional surgical theatres, not in the casual arrangement of a craftsman's shop. Whoever worked here was trained in surgery not weaponsmithing, and brought that training to the work. The item description for the tiny music box, the memento from Gascoigne's family, uses language that implies the melody it plays was composed by Gascoigne's wife specifically for him, but the melody itself is a recognizable folk song in the game's broader musical library, one that predates Gascoigne's marriage by the internal timeline. One reading is that Gascoigne's wife chose an existing song she knew would reach him. Another reading is darker. The cathedral ward's east wing, accessible through a locked door, often bypassed by players focused on progression, contains an intact painting of a woman whose face has been carefully scratched out. All other identifying features remain. The scratching was done after the painting was hung, based on the damage pattern to the frame around the canvas. The elevator shaft in the cathedral ward, if you look down into it, contains carved text on the shaft walls that is partially obscured by the elevator platform. What is readable appears to be a list of names. The format of the list matches the format used in the game for recording patients in the research hall. The fog effects inside the Grand Cathedral intensify when Vicar Amelia is below 50% health. This is a subtle environmental design choice that ties the physical state of the building to the state of the beast within it, suggesting that Vicar Amelia and the cathedral are more interconnected than a simple boss in a room reading would imply. The street vendor NPCs in the cathedral ward area, present in early versions of the game, were removed before final release, but their item sets remain in the game's data. The items they were intended to sell include a specific tool that would have made a certain puzzle in the game much easier to solve, and its removal made that puzzle significantly more obscure. Josefka's Clinic, accessible from the cathedral ward by an alternate entrance, has medical equipment that is more advanced than anything seen in the main clinic. The equipment in the back of the clinic is not just more modern, it is categorically different, designed for a different kind of procedure than the healing church publicly administers. The windows of the cathedral ward's residential buildings above the main path are all shuttered except for one 3 stories up on the east side, which has a curtain that moves periodically. The movement is not on a randomized timer, it is on a fixed interval. The blood echoes left by Father Gascoigne's death contain an unusually high value for an early game boss. The numerical value, if treated as a measurement rather than a game mechanic number, corresponds to a specific quantity referenced in a mid-game item description about blood measurement and potency. One reading of this is that Gascoigne had been consuming significant quantities of refined blood for far longer than his physical condition suggested. The grand staircase leading to the Grand Cathedral has 36 steps. 36 appears repeatedly in Bloodborne's numerical lore in contexts related to ritual completion and cyclic processes. Most staircases in the game's architecture use 12 or 24 steps. The 36-step staircase is the only one of its count in the entire game. The armour of the church servants has a layer visible at the hem that is not part of the cloth. It is a secondary material with a specific texture that in real-world historical terms would indicate waxed linen, a material historically used in surgical garments to prevent contamination. Church servants are wearing surgical protection underneath their ceremonial robes. The sound design of the cathedral ward includes a low hum that is constant and unchanging, regardless of combat state, time of night, or player location within the ward. The hum is pitched at a specific frequency, a frequency that, in acoustics research, is known to produce mild feelings of unease in human listeners when sustained for more than a few minutes. The amygdala on the cathedral ward buildings holds a different grip pose on the east-facing wall compared to the west-facing wall. This is an animation detail that only becomes meaningful once you know that east and west in Yharnam have specific ritual significance. Based on the Chalice dungeon layout geography, east is the direction of the sea, and therefore of the Great Ones. The item dropped by church servants in the cathedral ward, sedatives, have a description that says they are used to suppress the insight response. The phrasing treats insight as a response, like an allergic reaction, not a quality. The church is suppressing insight in its servants as a matter of institutional policy. The collapsed section of floor in the Healing Church workshop leads if you drop down to a lower area with a specific item and a note. Most players see this. Fewer players check the underside of the floor they just fell through. There is text carved into the underside of the floorboards, not visible from above, only readable after the fall. The bell on the Grand Cathedral spire is not visible from the ground level in any part of the cathedral ward. It is too high. But when the game's bell sound triggers from that specific spire, the audio directionality is correct. The sound comes from directly above, from a height consistent with the spire, which means the audio team modelled the sound source at the actual height of a bell that the visual art team placed out of sight. Chapter 3: Old Yharnam. Fire, Beasts, and Buried History. Old Yharnam is presented as a burned district, a part of the city that was cleansed by fire in a previous outbreak. But the fires in Old Yharnam are still burning when you arrive. The game's timeline suggests the cleansing happened decades before the current events, which means either the fires have been burning for decades or someone has been maintaining them. The church hunter's statement that Old Yharnam was burned in the name of containing a previous outbreak is the only piece of information the game gives you about the district's past. But if you look at the buildings in Old Yharnam, they are not burned uniformly. Some areas are devastated, others are barely touched. A proper firebombing leaves a more even pattern. What happened in Old Yharnam was targeted, not broad. Diura, the hunter who fires at you from the tower in Old Yharnam, will lower his weapon if you approach him peacefully through a specific route. His dialogue when you do so contains a detail most players miss because they are fighting him. He refers to the beasts of Old Yharnam as them, not it, or the beasts. He treats them as individuals. The beasts in Old Yharnam move differently than the beasts in Central Yharnam. They are faster, more coordinated, and more likely to use terrain. One reading of this is that the Old Yharnam beasts have been in beast form for much longer and have adapted to it. That beasthood, over time, does not degrade intelligence, but transforms it. The Kirkhammer weapon has a church-marked locking mechanism, meaning it was issued by the Healing Church. If the Healing Church issued weapons to hunters and then burned the district those hunters were protecting, the implications about the church's relationship with its own personnel are significant. The bloodletting beast fought in Old Yharnam, in its underground dungeon, is visually distinct from the beasts above ground. It has had its chest surgically opened and its organs rearranged in a pattern consistent with specific medical diagrams found in the research hall much later in the game. Something used it as a subject. The church cannons mounted near Jura's tower are aimed not at the beasts below, but at the buildings. The angle of the cannons, if traced along their sight lines, targets structural points in the Old Yharnam buildings, supports and foundations, rather than open ground. These cannons were positioned to bring down buildings, not suppress beasts. There are children's shoes in Old Yharnam near a window on one of the upper floors. A single pair, placed neatly by the window. Nothing else in the room explains them or elaborates on them. The game simply leaves them there. The audio of Old Yharnam contains, beneath the fire and beast sounds, a persistent groaning that is consistent in pitch and rhythm. The groaning does not come from any visible beast. It comes from the ground, from the underground area beneath Old Yharnam that the game accesses much later through the Chalice dungeon system. The bridge that separates Upper Old Yharnam from the deeper sections has a partially collapsed section that you can see if you look over the side. The collapse is not from age or neglect. The break is clean, consistent with explosive demolition. Someone destroyed a section of the bridge deliberately to slow access to the lower district. The belfry area near Jura's tower contains bells that are cracked. Cracked bells cannot ring, but the sound design still includes faint bell tones in this area on a recurring cycle. One interpretation is that the sound is a recording of what the bells used to sound like, preserved in the same way the game preserves other ghostly traces of Yharnam's past. The beast patient enemies in Old Yharnam, beasts that still wear hospital gowns, have ID tags on their wrists if you get close enough to see them. The ID tags are blank. Their identities were already erased before the outbreak consumed them. Jura's parting item, the powder keg badge given if you spare him, is described in terms that suggest the powder keg hunters were a faction that rejected the healing church's authority long before the current outbreak. The badge's design element matches architectural details in Old Yharnam that predate the church's influence, which suggests the powder kegs were native to this district specifically. The fire barrels scattered through Old Yharnam are not placed randomly. They are in positions consistent with pre-positioned accelerants. Specifically, they are near structural supports and ventilation gaps, the same positions a controlled demolition team would use. The cleansing of Old Yharnam was prepared well in advance of when the church claims it became necessary. The beast-possessed soul encountered in Old Yharnam, the large beast curled near a group of smaller ones, has a behavior that reads differently once you understand the context. It is protecting the smaller beasts. It is not sleeping among them. It is guarding. The locked door in Old Yharnam that requires the key from the chapel messenger hatch opens into a room that contains research notes. The notes are in a handwriting style that matches no named NPC in the game, but the medical terminology is specific enough that you can cross-reference it with the terminology in the research hall. The same researcher was in both places. The architectural style of Old Yharnam's lower district, pre-fire, is older than the central city. The stonework uses techniques that were superseded in the rest of Yharnam. This is a city within the city, older and different in origin. The torch enemies in Old Yharnam have a specific behavior when they die near their own torch. If a burning torch is near the body will eventually catch fire. The fire then spreads in the game's physics engine. Jura, from his tower, will not intervene even when beasts are burning within his line of sight. He only intervenes when the player acts. This distinction in his behavior is never commented on. The item description for the Old Hunter's set, equipment found in Old Yharnam, contains the phrase, "before the age of firearms." This is interesting because firearms are central to the hunter's toolkit, which suggests the hunters of Old Yharnam predate the current hunting methodology and may have been fighting beasts with very different tools. The chalk outlines drawn on certain floors in Old Yharnam's accessible interiors are not the chalk outlines of bodies. They are the chalk outlines of ritual circles, specific geometric forms used in the game's chalice dungeon ceremonies. Someone was practicing ritual work in Old Yharnam long before it was officially sanctioned, or long after it was officially burned. The drain system in Old Yharnam flows toward a central collection point that, based on the geography, is located directly above an accessible chalice dungeon level. The drain and the dungeon opening share a vertical access. Whatever was being disposed of through Old Yharnam's drainage went directly into the Pythunrian ruins below. The large windows in the Old Yharnam church, the tall structure visible early in the area, have bars on them that are bent outward, not broken inward by someone trying to get in, bent outward by something that was inside, trying to get out. The church was used to contain something during the cleansing. Jura's cannon on the tower has blast marks on the parapet around it that show it has been fired repeatedly in a consistent direction. Not down at the streets of Old Yharnam, where the beasts are, but outward, toward the walls of the city. Jura has been firing at the city walls. He has been trying to make a way out for the beasts. The sound of the large beast enemies in Old Yharnam has a harmonic undertone that is consistent with the sound used for beast echoes in the Chalice dungeons. Old Yharnam's beasts are connected, somehow, to something underground. Their sound carries a resonance that should not be there for surface-level creatures. The walkway connecting Jura's tower to the church above is partially collapsed, meaning Jura cannot easily leave his position. The collapse was recent. The wood is not rotted, just broken. Someone broke Jura's exit after he climbed the tower. He is not just choosing to stay. His retreat has been cut off. The bonfire smoke in Old Yharnam, from the large outdoor fires burning throughout the district, rises in consistent columns despite the wind that can be felt in the area. The smoke does not drift. This is because the fires are positioned in wind shadow, areas where the buildings block the prevailing wind. Whoever placed those fires knew the local wind patterns. The beast that attacks in the enclosed section near the first shortcut in Old Yharnam is clearly pacing before the player arrives. When you enter, It is in mid-pace, not waiting. It was already moving when you got there. It has been pacing for a long time. The old Yharnam hunter corpse found hanging from the belfry area is wearing an incomplete version of the hunter's attire, missing one glove. The missing glove is not on the body or near it. It is on the other side of the district, in a room that requires taking a different path to reach. The hunter's final movements can be traced by the glove's location. The specific variety of moss growing on old Yharnam's outer walls is a type that thrives in areas with high airborne blood content. The game's environmental art team included this detail. The moss on old Yharnam's walls is a different species than the moss on other game areas, visible only at close range. The blood of old Yharnam has been in the air for a very long time. The beast encounter, in the section accessible by falling off the main path, a dangerous but navigable fall that most players avoid, leads to a room with two large beasts and an item that is found nowhere else in the main game. The item's description references Old Yharnam specifically and suggests the prior cleansing was not the first time fire was used in this district. The specific brick used in Old Yharnam's construction is a different composition than the brick used in Central Yharnam, visible in the texture detail of cracked and broken sections. The Old Yharnam brick was fired at a lower temperature, making it softer. It was cheaper construction, consistent with this having been a poorer district before the church's influence reached Yharnam. The final accessible room in Old Yharnam, before dropping into the Chalice dungeon approach, has a window overlooking the entire lower district. From this window, the full scope of the destruction is visible in a single frame. The developers clearly intended this view. It is the only point in the game where you can see the whole of Old Yharnam from above. It looks much larger than it feels from inside it. Jura's spare ammunition, the cannonballs stored near his tower, is sufficient for approximately 40 shots. The blast marks on the parapet and surrounding walls suggest he has fired significantly more than 40 shots. He has been resupplied. Someone is maintaining Jura's ability to defend his position. The beast footprints, visible in the ashen soot of Old Yharnam streets, follow patterns that, if mapped, show circular patrol routes around specific buildings. The same buildings that have structural integrity, the ones that were not targeted by the church's cannons. The beasts have been protecting certain buildings, not randomly wandering. Protecting the locked gate at the back of Old Yharnam, the one that, if opened, would connect the district to an adjacent map area, has a keyhole that is full of ash. It has been unused long enough for ash to accumulate in its mechanism. The gate has not been opened since the fire. Whatever the gate was meant to connect is accessible only through other means. The inscription above the Old Yharnam church entrance is partially destroyed by fire damage, but still readable in fragments. What can be read suggests it was originally a dedication to a healing church figure whose name is not recognizable from any other in-game text. An entire faction leader has been written out of the game's readable history, with only this partial inscription as evidence of their existence. The two towers flanking the main approach to Old Yharnam from the upper route had, according to their visible attachment points, large chain mechanisms that have since been removed. The chains would have connected the towers to something in the space between them, possibly a portcullis or drawbridge mechanism. Old Yharnam had a controlled entrance that was deliberately dismantled before the fire. Chapter 4: Hemwick Charnel Lane, The Witches and the Forgotten Dead. Hemwick Charnel Lane is the game's most under-examined area, and I think that is because it is positioned as a brief detour rather than a primary destination. But the lane contains details that recontextualize several things the game has already told you, and I want to spend real time here. The Charnel Lane, a lane where bodies are disposed of, is, by definition, a place where the city's dead are taken before burial or burning. The fact that Yharnam has such a lane and that it connects to one of the game's more significant boss encounters suggests that the body disposal practices of the city are more consequential than they first appear. The Witch of Hemwick is not singular. There are two witches, and they share health. The sharing of health between two separate bodies is a lore detail disguised as a game mechanic. It points toward the idea that the witches are not two individuals, but two aspects of a single entity or practice. The runes that appear around the witches during their fog summoning attack are readable in the game's rune alphabet. What they spell, when decoded, is a request, not a command. The witches are asking the fog to come, not controlling it. The wandering madmen enemies in Hemwick, the shambling human figures, are looking for something specific. Their movement patterns, if you follow them long enough, without triggering combat, show them searching around specific points in the environment. Each wandering madman has a unique search pattern centered on a different location. The Charnel Lane's name appears in a note in Central Yharnam that predates the current outbreak, suggesting the lane was already in use long before things went wrong. Yharnam was disposing of significant numbers of bodies even during peaceful times. The eyes in jars found in Hemwick, items collectible from the area, have a description that suggests they were cultivated, not removed. The phrasing is agricultural. These eyes were grown for a purpose. The item found after defeating the Witch of Hemwick, the rune workshop tool, is described as something the old hunters once used. But the healing church outlawed the Witches of Hemwick were apparently maintaining a tool set that the official hunting establishment had declared forbidden. The witches were archivists of banned knowledge. The charnel lane has a section near the midpoint where the bodies on the carts are not beast victims. They are wearing the equipment of hunters. Someone in Hemwick has been collecting dead hunters, and their bodies are being transported somewhere in the lane's internal logistics. The fog summoned by the witches has a specific visual density that blocks line of sight at a shorter distance than other fogs in the game. It is practical fog, designed to conceal, not simply to obscure. The witches use it as a tool. The executioner enemies found near Hemwick are transporting bodies on hooked chains. The execution method implied by the hooks is not beheading or hanging. It is a form of meat processing. The executioners are not burying or burning the dead they carry. They are taking them somewhere for another purpose. The gravel road through Hemwick is well maintained compared to the roads in the rest of Yharnam. The stones have been recently levelled, and the ruts from cart traffic are shallow and fresh. Hemwick Charnel Lane was in active regular use on the night the hunt began. The body disposal operation was fully operational. The crows in Hemwick are larger than the crows in Central Yharnam. This is a texture and model scale difference that only becomes apparent if you have the two areas' crow populations loaded simultaneously in memory, which is not possible in normal gameplay. The information is visible in the game's asset data. Hemwick's crows are a different population. The well in the centre of the Hemwick settlement area, not the lane itself, but the small residential cluster, contains an unusual item if you use the throwing stone on its opening. A specific sound response plays that does not match the expected hollow well echo. Something inside the well responds to the stone. The witch enemies that appear as decoys during the Witch of Hemwick fight, the false witches that appear before the real boss is revealed, have unique idle animations different from the final boss version. The decoy witches look upward, the real witch looks at the player. This distinction is almost never noticed because the decoys are immediately hostile, but the animation difference was built and deliberately differentiated. The item description for the Carol rune Moon, a rune associated with blood echoes and the healing church, states it was discovered upon the surface of the moon, not in a dream, not in a dungeon, on the actual surface of the moon. Someone was on the moon's surface, or perceived themselves to be, and found it there. The moon in Bloodborne is a place that can be visited, not just observed. The Hemwick Cemetery, the small burial ground attached to the charnel lane, has grave markers facing in two different directions. Most face east, consistent with Christian burial tradition. 6 face west. The 6 graves facing west are grouped together, slightly separated from the others. The people in those 6 graves were buried differently, either by their own request or by someone else's decision. The blood on the ground in Hemwick, near the witch's lair, has a pattern that, if viewed from directly above, using the camera in a specific way, forms an outline consistent with one of the game's Carol rune symbols. The blood pattern is not random. It is a rune drawn in blood on a very large scale. The locked house in Hemwick, with the barred windows and the candle visible inside, contains, based on the audio when you stand near it, at least one person who is alive and aware. Knocking sounds come from inside in response to combat sounds outside. The person inside is reacting to noise. They are making deliberate sounds. They are trying to communicate. The Oeskis message, the letter that sets up the game's opening, is connected to Hemwick through a detail in its wording. The letter uses a phrase about the location of the clinic that, if you know where Hemwick is on the map, implies Yosefko was aware of Hemwick's operations. The clinic's access path runs through the Charnel Lanes territory. They knew about each other. The mad ones that emerged from the ground in Hemwick during the witch fight emerge from specific points that, if connected by lines, form a specific geometric shape. The shape is a closed curve, not a circle. A more complex closed curve associated in the game's arcane mathematics with transformation and enclosure. The mad ones are not emerging randomly. They are defining a boundary. The item Frenzied Cold Blood, dropped rarely in Hemwick, has a description that includes the line, belonging to a Frenzied Yharnam native. Hemwick is connected to Yharnam, but is not part of Yharnam proper. It is outside the city's walls. A Yharnam native in Hemwick suggests someone travelled to the Charnel Lane, became frenzied there, and died there. They went to the Charnel Lane for a reason, and did not leave. The tree line visible at the far end of Hemwick, beyond the accessible area, is a different species of tree than those in the Forbidden Woods. The game's two forested areas have different ecological compositions. This is a detail of environmental design specificity that exceeds what is necessary for gameplay and suggests the world was built with a real geography in mind. The ambient crows in Hemwick respond differently to the player's lantern than the crows in Central Yharnam. The Central Yharnam crows scatter when the lantern light passes over them. The Hemwick crows do not scatter, they orient toward the light. These crows have been trained or conditioned to associate light with something other than danger. The Witch of Hemwick's movement speed in her second phase, after the fog drops and she teleports to a new location, is measured by fans to be exactly twice her first phase movement speed. The doubling is precise, not approximate. The second phase is not a different state of the same creature. The second phase, Witch moves like she has different legs than the first phase Witch. The gate connecting Hemwick to the Cathedral Ward locks from the Cathedral Ward side, not from the Hemwick side. The Healing Church sealed the Charnel Lane off from the rest of the city at some point and placed the locking mechanism on the church's side, meaning the church could reopen the lane whenever it chose. The Charnel Lane was not abandoned, it was closed on the church's terms. The specific layout of the Hemwick Witch's indoor lair, the final room, matches the layout of operating theatres in early Victorian surgical hospitals. The raised platform, where the witches appear, the surrounding observation space, the specific lighting provided by the room's high windows. All of it is consistent with a surgical theatre design. The witches live in a repurposed place of medical demonstration. The sound the rune workshop tool makes when first obtained, a brief high-pitched resonance, matches a frequency used in the game's Chalice dungeon ritual audio. The tool remembers its purpose and activates a small portion of it when touched. The Madman's Knowledge items found in the Hemwick area are more numerous per square area than in any other part of the main game. Hemwick has a higher concentration of mines that broke. The Charnel Lane is where Yharnam's lost people were taken, and a meaningful number of them broke under whatever they witnessed there. The height of the Hemwick settlement's buildings, squat, low, thick-walled, is consistent with the building style used in areas historically associated with bodies and their processes. Low ceilings for efficient heat retention during cold season body preservation. Thick walls for insulation. The architecture of Hemwick was purpose-built for what happened there. The mud on the boots of the executioner enemies in Hemwick is a specific reddish clay that matches the soil composition visible in the exposed earth sections of the Charnel Lane. The executioners come from Hemwick. They originate here, Their equipment may carry healing church markings, but they belong to this lane. The number of functional lanterns visible in Hemwick at any one time during a standard run through the area is 12. 12 is the number associated repeatedly in Bloodborne's lore with the internal structure of the healing church's hierarchy. The charnel lane has 12 active lights because 12 specific people maintain it, one for each lantern. The cart tracks in the mud of Hemwick, leading from the lane toward a sealed wall at the far end of the accessible area, continue past the wall, visible through the wall's gap as a continuation of the same cart ruts. There is a road beyond the sealed wall that the game does not let you access. It continues somewhere the player cannot go. Chapter 5, Byrgenwerth, Knowledge, Water, and the First Sin. Byrgenwerth is, in many ways, the game's first true lore reveal zone, the place where Bloodborne stops hinting and starts confirming. I saved it for Chapter 5, because everything in Chapters 1 through 4 is more meaningful once you know what Byrgenwerth is. And I wanted the earlier chapters to carry their full weight before this. The exterior of Byrgenwerth College is overgrown, in a specific pattern. The vines have grown primarily over the eastern windows, the side facing the sea. Growth patterns of vines follow light, and the eastern face should receive morning light, which would discourage rather than encourage this growth. The vines grew towards something other than sunlight. The scholars of Byrgenwerth were studying Pumerian ruins before the events of the game. The ruins they were studying contained the Great Ones, cosmic entities that the game treats as a higher order of being. The scholars' goal was communion with these entities through exposure to blood and arcane knowledge. This is the origin point of everything that went wrong. Master Willem, still alive in the Garden of Byrgenwerth when you arrive, sits in a wheelchair facing the lake. He does not speak. He points repeatedly toward the water. His only communication is directional. He is trying to tell you something about the lake. The spider runes found in Byrgenwerth deal with discovery and insight. The rune's visual design looks like a web, not a spider, and the description uses the word web in a context suggesting connection rather than trap. Byrgenwerth understood knowledge as a network, not a hierarchy. The poison swamp surrounding Byrgenwerth is not random environmental hazard design. The specific plant that produces the swamp's poison in the game's internal ecosystem is a plant associated in the broader fiction with the deep sea, with pressure and depth. The swamp is a controlled environment, reproducing deep-water chemistry on land. The Lunarium, the moon viewing platform at the top of Byrgenwerth, faces due south over the lake. Lunaria, in real-world botanical history, were gardens specifically cultivated to be viewed under moonlight. The flowers planted in them were chosen for their appearance at night, not in day. The Byrgenwerth Lunarium was designed for night use, which means the scholars were doing their most important work after dark. Rom, the vacuous spider, was once a scholar of Byrgenwerth. Her boss title contains the word vacuous, meaning empty, specifically empty of thought. The vacuous spider was once capable of knowledge and has been reduced to emptiness. The transformation did not elevate her. It consumed her. Rom's function in the lore is to prevent perception of the celestial bodies above Yharnam, specifically the truth of what the moon is and what it contains. The amygdalae on the buildings of the cathedral ward are visible to players only after Rom is defeated. Before that, you can look directly at the buildings where they cling and not see them. Rom is a blindfold for the entire city. The item descriptions of arcane items found in Byrgenwerth use mathematical language, ratios, geometric terms, measurements. That was completely absent from the item descriptions in earlier game areas. The shift in language is a shift in methodology. Byrgenwerth treated cosmic power as a science, not a faith. The lake beneath Byrgenwerth connects, by the game's internal geography, to the fishing hamlet, an area added in the DLC that many players experience before Byrgenwerth on repeated playthroughs. If you know the fishing hamlet first, Byrgenwerth becomes a sequel to a story about the sea. If you know Byrgenwerth first, the fishing hamlet becomes a prequel. The game's structure allows both readings to function. The entry hall of Byrgenwerth contains furniture consistent with a lecture room. Long tables, bench seating, raised dais at the front. But the benches have been pushed back against the walls. The last thing that happened in this room required the floor to be cleared. The furniture arrangement preserved the moment. The globe in the Byrgenwerth study. A large ornamental globe, visible in one of the upper rooms, depicts continents that do not match any real-world geography. The world of Bloodborne has a different physical geography than ours, and this globe confirms it. The world is similar in size and general composition, but different in specific arrangement. The books on the shelves in Byrgenwerth's library are physically there. They are modelled, but they cannot be interacted with. They do not glow as items. They cannot be read. They are furniture that suggests a library without providing one. In a game about knowledge and its consequences, all the books are closed. The spider rune, associated with Byrgenwerth and the choir, appears in the architecture of Byrgenwerth as an actual spiderweb in the northeast corner of the uppermost room. An actual spiderweb rendered in the game's geometry in the specific room associated with rune creation. The art team put a real web in the room where the web rune originated. The tree line surrounding Byrgenwerth is of a different composition than the Forbidden Woods, even though the two are geographically adjacent. The trees immediately around the college are older. Their trunks are thicker, their canopy lower, and their bark darker. Byrgenwerth has been here long enough for its immediate trees to grow to maturity. The college is significantly older than the healing church. Master Willem's wheelchair shows signs of long-term use. The leather is cracked and the metal joints are worn. He has been in that chair for a very long time. Whether he has been unable to walk or has chosen not to is one of the readings the game leaves open, but either way, the wheelchair tells you that whatever happened to Master Willem happened slowly. The spiders that appear as enemies in Byrgenwerth are different from the spiders in the Chalice dungeons. The Byrgenwerth spiders have humanoid features, specifically human hands where a spider's front legs would be. The Chalice dungeon spiders are more purely arachnid. The transformation toward greater spiderness runs backward in Byrgenwerth. These spiders are in an earlier stage than the dungeon versions. The chalk equations on the Byrgenwerth blackboards are partially erased in most rooms, with only sections remaining. But one room's blackboard has a complete equation that no one erased. It is the only one. The equation involves a variable that appears in no other in-game context. Whatever this equation describes, the Byrgenwerth scholar who wrote it, finished it, and left it. The telescope in Byrgenwerth's top-floor study points at a specific star. The star it points at is part of a constellation whose name, in the game's internal star naming convention, documented in the Chalice dungeons, translates to the place where the eye opened. Byrgenwerth's telescope was tracking the location associated with the first instance of cosmic awareness. The founding motto of Byrgenwerth, "Fear the old blood," appears in the same phrasing as the graffiti in Central Yharnam. This means the warning on Yharnam's walls did not originate with Yharnam's citizens. It originated with Byrgenwerth's scholars, who then either wrote it themselves in the city or whose students spread it. The warning was academic before it was popular. The floor tiles in Byrgenwerth's main hall have a specific wear pattern consistent with heavy foot traffic between the library and the laboratory. Two rooms at opposite ends of the hall. Byrgenwerth's scholars walked constantly between the books and the experiments. The tiles under the direct path between those rooms are worn down noticeably more than the rest. The Byrgenwerth pond, the small water feature in the garden, has a depth that exceeds what is physically possible based on the surrounding terrain. The ground around it slopes upward within a few meters, but the pond appears to continue downward past what the geometry allows. The pond is not a pond, it is an opening. The guidance rune associated with Byrgenwerth has an item description that uses the word resonance in a context suggesting two-directional communication. Not guidance from above, but guidance between equals. Byrgenwerth was not seeking instruction from the Great Ones. They were seeking conversation. The arrogance of that ambition is the specific thing that made everything worse. The research building at the back of Byrgenwerth, the structure behind the main college building, has a locked door whose keyhole is filled with what appears to be crystallized blood. The door has not been opened since before the current night. Whatever is in that research building was sealed away before the outbreak and has not been disturbed since. The numbing mist items found in the Byrgenwerth area have a description that says they work by numbing the senses to the arcane. In a location defined by arcane excess and cosmic exposure, someone prepared and stockpiled a counter-agent. The Byrgenwerth scholars were scared of something in their own facility and prepared a response to it. The iron gate leading to the Byrgenwerth Lake, the one that opens during Rom's second phase, is operated by a mechanism that triggers only during the fight. The mechanism was designed to open at a specific point during the encounter, meaning the fight with Rom was anticipated by whoever designed the gate. The gate's function was built in advance of the need for it. Rom's small spider children, the non-aggressive spiders during her fight, have a specific behavior. They form a ring around Rom at the start of the fight, then spread outward as the fight progresses. The ring they form at the start is a specific diameter. That diameter, converted to a measurement, matches a number in the game's Chalice dungeon ritual texts. Rom's babies are forming a ritual boundary. The final readable note in Byrgenwerth, found in the garden near Master Willem, references a specific month and a specific weather condition. The note does not give a year, but the month and weather match the conditions of the game's opening night. The note was written the night the game begins. Someone was taking notes as things fell apart. Willem's gesture, his pointing arm, is, if you follow the exact trajectory of his finger, aimed at a specific point on the lake's surface. Not the center, not the far shore. A specific point. If you stand on the lake during the Rom fight, the point Willem's finger tracks to is the exact spawn point of the Rom boss encounter. He is pointing at her specifically. The dead scholars in Byrgenwerth, enemies and corpses alike, are wearing a uniform that includes a specific brooch at the collar. The brooch design is a closed eye. Every Byrgenwerth scholar wore a closed eye as their institutional emblem. The school that opened eyes to cosmic truth advertised itself with a symbol of closed eyes. What this contradiction suggests about their self-awareness is one of the more interesting readings in the game. Chapter 6. The Forbidden Woods. Nature, Experiments, and Hidden Villages. The Forbidden Woods are forbidden specifically because they connect Yharnam to the outside world. The serpent men encountered here are the first enemies in the game that are clearly not local. They do not fit the disease pattern, the beast pattern, or the church pattern. They are from outside Yharnam entirely, and their presence in the woods raises questions the game does not directly answer. The windmill in the Forbidden Woods is operational. Its gears are turning, its sails are moving, and it is processing something. There is no miller, no worker. The windmill is running itself. The research village in the Forbidden Woods, the cluster of buildings deeper in the woods, is connected to a Yosefka's clinic via an internal passage. This connection suggests that whatever was being done in the village was done with the clinic's knowledge, and possibly at its direction. The village is not an independent experiment. It is an annex. The snake ball enemies in the Forbidden Woods, mass aggregations of snakes, are not naturally occurring. In the game's internal ecology, snakes behave individualistically. A mass of snakes moving as a coordinated unit requires a coordinating force. What is coordinating them is not addressed. The gravestones in the Forbidden Woods village are different from the gravestones in Yharnam proper. The Yharnam gravestones use an architectural style consistent with 19th century European mortuary art. The Forbidden Woods gravestones are older, much older, and their inscriptions are in a different script. The water source for the Forbidden Woods village is a stream that runs from inside the woods toward the city. If the stream runs from the woods to Yharnam, then whatever is in the water of the Forbidden Woods is also in Yharnam's water supply. This is either an oversight or a very deliberate detail about how long Yharnam has been contaminated. The test subject enemies in the Forbidden Woods laboratory building are dressed in the same gowns as patients in Yosefka's clinic. The connection has been established before you visit both locations, but most players miss it because the clinic comes later in the default routing. The item description for the tonsil stone, obtained from a specific NPC who appears after the Forbidden Woods, describes it as something the Great Ones use to communicate need rather than intent. The stone is a signal for help, not a command. The entity that gave it to you needs something from you specifically. The cave system running beneath the Forbidden Woods connects to multiple locations in the game's broader map without using the lamp system. Physical geography, rather than fast travel, links these spaces, which means the game has a fully realized underground geography that functions independently of the surface world. The poison in the Forbidden Woods cave is identical in chemical description to the poison of the Chalice dungeons, suggesting that the woods sit above a section of the dungeon network, and that the dungeon's biological contamination has been seeping upward for a very long time. The shortcut in the Forbidden Woods, the one that connects the early section to the village through the poison swamp, passes through an area with a specific type of fungal growth not found anywhere else in the accessible game world. The fungus appears to be the same type described in an unused item found in the game's data files associated with the Pthumerian queens. The note found in the research village, written in handwriting that matches a specific NPC in another part of the game, predates that NPC's apparent presence in the area by a significant margin based on the paper's condition. The person writing in the village was there before they appear elsewhere in the game's accessible timeline. The laboratory in the Forbidden Woods has a second floor area accessible by a ladder that most players use only to exit. If you stop on the second floor and look at the research tables, the material layout is different from the first floor. The second floor has different samples, different equipment, and a different level of organization. 2 different researchers worked in this building, and they had different methodologies. The Serpent Men's presence in the Forbidden Woods suggests they have been there long enough to establish a population. You encounter groups of them, not singletons. A reproducing population of Serpent Men in the Forbidden Woods, visible from Yharnam, raises the question of when the woods became forbidden, and whether the Serpent Men are the reason, or the result. The large snake enemy encountered at the entrance to the cave section of the Forbidden Woods is not hostile until approached. Its initial behavior is evasive. It tries to move away. The snake only becomes aggressive when retreat is cut off. Large-scale snake aggression in Bloodborne is reactive, not predatory. The snake does not want to fight you any more than you necessarily want to fight it. The wooden structures in the Forbidden Woods research village were built by someone who was not a trained carpenter. The joinery is functional but amateurish. It would hold under normal conditions but not indefinitely. The village was built by researchers who needed shelter fast, not by a construction crew following a plan. The path through the Forbidden Woods that leads to the Byrgenwerth shortcut, the fastest route to the next mandatory boss, bypasses the research village entirely. If you take the optimal path, you miss everything the village tells you. This was presumably a deliberate routing choice by the designers, but it means a first-time player following a guide never sees the village's contents at all. The bird sounds in the Forbidden Woods are not the same birds as in Yharnam. The audio team recorded different species for the wooded area, species associated with specific habitats and climates that place the Forbidden Woods in a different ecological zone than the city. The woods are environmentally different, not just visually different. The old workshop in the Forbidden Woods, distinct from the main research village, contains hunter tools that have been maintained, not abandoned. The oil in the workbench is fresh. The tools are clean. Someone was maintaining this workshop on the night the hunt began, and has not been back since. The 2 Forbidden Woods areas, the upper section and the lower cave section, have different gravity behavior in the game's physics. Objects dropped in the upper section fall at normal speed. Objects dropped in the lower cave fall slightly faster. The developers either adjusted the physics parameters per zone, or there is a legitimate gravity difference between the above-ground and underground areas of the Forbidden Woods. The pungent blood cocktails found abundantly in the Forbidden Woods are more concentrated than the ones found in Yharnam. They attract a wider radius of beast attention, and for a longer duration. Someone in the Forbidden Woods was working on potency improvements to the cocktail formula. The forest has been a site of blood tool refinement, not just observation. The moon visible from the Forbidden Woods clearing. The only clear sky available in the area is at a different angle than the moon visible from the cathedral ward. The two views from adjacent map areas show the same moon in different positions in the sky. This is a continuity detail that points toward the moon not behaving according to normal celestial mechanics in Bloodborne's world. Chapter 7. Yahargul, Unseen Village, Abduction, the One Reborn, and Temporal Instability. Yahargul is a district you can visit twice, and the two versions of the city tell completely different stories about what is happening to Yharnam at a structural level. The first visit, accessed early through a side passage, shows you a village in early stage disruption. The second visit, after Rom's defeat, shows you the same streets in a state of advanced cosmological distortion. The changes between the two visits are not just atmospheric, they are architectural. Buildings that were intact before are altered. Spaces that were closed are open. This is not a lighting change. The Shadows of Yharnam, boss fight, the three shadow enemies fought in Yahargul, contains a specific detail in the timing of their attack patterns. The three shadows never attack simultaneously unless one of them has been below 50% health for more than 10 seconds. The coordination in their attack intervals suggests a shared decision-making process, not individual AI. The ringing bell that triggers enemies to invade in Yahargul is wielded by NPCs referred to as bell-ringing women. Their item description notes that they are summoning things from a separate plane. The item they carry, the sinister resonant bell, uses the word sinister in its traditional sense. Left-handed. Left-handedness, in occult tradition, frequently denotes inversion or reversal. The bell-ringing women are calling things from a reversed world. The architecture of Yahargul contains cells, prison cells, clearly on multiple floors of its main tower structure. The cells were not built to hold criminals. The dimensions are wrong for that, and the restraint mechanisms face inward rather than outward. These cells were built to hold people who were being brought in, not people who were escaping. The One Reborn boss, a massive aggregate of corpses and body parts, has a specific sound design detail when it is at full health. The individual sounds of multiple people breathing can be heard within the main sound mass of the creature. The people within the One Reborn are not dead. At full health, some of them are still alive. The choir members encountered in Yahargul, in the second version of the area, are positioned in window frames looking out at the streets below. They are not patrolling, they are observing. The choir's presence in Yahargul in the post-Rome version of the area suggests they moved in immediately after whatever Rom's death enabled. The celestial mobs in post-Rom Yahargul look upward during their idle state. All of them, consistently. They are looking at something above the city that ordinary characters cannot perceive. The thing above the city that becomes visible after Rom's defeat, the red moon, is what they are looking at. But their idle animations were looking upward before the moon appeared, meaning they could see it before you could. There is a specific alley in Yahargul that serves no gameplay purpose. It leads to a dead end with no item and no enemy. But the walls of the alley have a texture that at high resolution shows partial handprints, multiple handprints, layered, made at different times. The iron door mechanisms in Yahargul use a locking system that can only be opened from outside. The people inside Yahargul cannot let themselves out. They were locked in by someone outside the district, and that locking mechanism was built into the architecture from the beginning. The corpse piles used in the creation of the One Reborn are based on their clothing, a mixture of civilians, church servants, and hunters. All three groups are represented in the construction of the boss. Whatever assembled the One Reborn was collecting specific types, not random bodies. The Unseen Village's name, specifically the Unseen descriptor, refers not to its hiddenness on the map, but to its status in the broader city. The other districts of Yharnam do not acknowledge its existence in dialogue or documentation. It is unseen not because it is hidden, but because the city has collectively decided not to see it. The second layer of Yhargul, accessible through a basement descent, has a different air quality in its audio design. The reverb profile changes significantly, suggesting the space is underground or enclosed in a very different material than stone. The walls of the second layer are not brick or masonry. They are something else. The bird cage carriers, enemies carrying large cages through Yhargul, have a specific cargo in one specific instance. One cage contains a completed hunter's toolset, neatly arranged. The cage is locked and the contents are intact. The carrier is moving it toward the Yhargul laboratory. A hunter's tools are being relocated, not abandoned. The Yhargul Chapel, a locked building accessible through a rear passage, contains an altar with an offering bowl that is still warm. The game's object descriptions do not address this. The warmth is conveyed through the audio design. The sound of settling metal, not through any text. The shadow enemies of Yhargul have a specific weakness to rightward dodge attacks, which is an unusual mechanical detail in a game where enemy weaknesses are rarely directional. The directional weakness is consistent with the shadow's attack momentum. They favor leftward attacks, which mechanically suggests a being that was built for a specific spatial orientation, not the fluid combat of most Bloodborne enemies. The One Reborn's attacks in its second phase create a circular area of effect that, if measured precisely, has a radius that matches the radius of the ritual circles used in Yhargul's chalice preparations. The One Reborn is generating ritual circles by existing. The choir members in the Yhargul windows are positioned at different heights throughout the building. The spacing of their heights, measured floor by floor, corresponds to a harmonic series. Each position is a multiple of the lowest one. The choir is arranged by interval, not randomly. They are positioned as a musical chord made physical. The enemies in early Yhargul, the bell ringers, and their summoned creatures, disappear in the late-game version of the district. This is expected. What is less expected is that their items also disappear. The bell ringers are gone, and so is anything they would have dropped. The items the late-game Yhargul provides are different items. The district is not just a reskinned version of itself. It has different contents. The Forbidden Woods path that connects to Yhargul is marked by a series of flags, coloured cloth on poles, that change in colour and condition between the two versions of the district. In early Yhargul, the flags are intact. In late Yhargul, some are burned and others are replaced with a different colour. Someone changed the flags between your visits. Someone was maintaining the marking system throughout the night. The Yhargul lamp, the one inside the district, requires you to have died inside Yhargul to first access. The game designs your first visit around death, and the lamp is only accessible after that death. The district is designed to kill you, take you, and then give you a way back. The mechanic mirrors the district's law function as an abduction site. The runes on the walls of Yhargul's cells, carved into the stone by the people who were held there, are in the game's arcane script and are readable. What they say, decoded, are dates, different dates, in different hands. The prisoners were marking the passage of time. The distance between the One Reborn spawn point and the Yhargul lamp is the longest sustained boss run in the game. If you die repeatedly, this is widely commented on by players. But what is less commented on is that the path to the boss passes through the most dense concentration of bell-ringing enemies in the area. Every attempt is a fresh abduction gauntlet. The game makes you experience the mechanism of Yhargul on a loop. The shadows of the Yhargul skyline, cast by the elevated moon in post-Rome Yhargul, are not consistent with a normal moon. The shadows are elongated and cast in multiple, slightly different directions, suggesting multiple light sources rather than one moon. After Rom's defeat, there is more than one thing casting light from above Yhargul. The boss room of the One Reborn, if you look at its ceiling, is not a ceiling, it is a floor. There is another level above the One Reborn's arena that is visible but inaccessible. The arena exists at the bottom of something, not at the top of something. You are fighting in a pit, not a room. The choir's note, visible in the Yahargul second area, the paper found on a body near the entrance to the lower district, is addressed to no one, no name, on the addressee line. The note is a report without a recipient, filed to an absent authority. The choir was sending updates to someone who had already left. Chapter 8. The Nightmare Frontier. Arcane Excess and the Price of Knowledge. The Nightmare Frontier is a space that exists outside the physical geography of Yharnam entirely. It is a dimension created or sustained by arcane excess, a place where the byproducts of Yharnam's experiments have accumulated. Understanding this changes how you read the landscape. The rocks, the poison swamp, the headless bloodletting beast, the amygdala boss, they are not native to this space. They are things that have been pushed here. The amygdala boss of the Nightmare Frontier has a specific behavioral tell that most players interpret as a phase transition. When it enters its second phase, it tears off its own arms and discards them. But the discarded arms continue to move after separation, which suggests the amygdala is not a creature with a central nervous system in the conventional sense. Each arm may have its own autonomous function. The headless enemies in the Nightmare Frontier, wearing cruciform shapes on their backs, are moving in a specific direction when idle. They are all moving toward the center of the map, toward something at the center that draws them even in their headless reduced state. The item found at the base of the cliff in the Nightmare Frontier, accessible through a specific falling path most players never find, contains a note that references Byrgenwerth by name and dates itself before the college's founding. The note was written about Byrgenwerth before Byrgenwerth existed, which either means the date is wrong or the note came from outside linear time. The Nightmare Frontier's sky is the most active sky in the base game. Clouds move, light shifts, and periodically something large and not cloud passes overhead. The passing shadow has a specific shape that, in silhouette, is consistent with the amygdala's profile when viewed from directly below. The lecture building, accessible from the Nightmare Frontier, is the only location in the game that exists in two versions, accessible at different points. The first floor is accessed in one nightmare state, the second floor in another. The two floors do not share an interior staircase. You cannot travel between them physically. You can only travel between them through the nightmare dream logic of the lamp system. The students encountered in the lecture building are not dead in the standard sense. Their posture and movement suggest a fugue state. They are ambulatory but absent. Their item drops include lecture theatre keys, which means they are still engaged in the practical maintenance of the building, even in their current condition. The blackboard inscriptions in the lecture building are legible and contain actual content, not lorem ipsum placeholder text. The equations on the boards are related to the insight system, the game's measure of cosmic awareness, and they treat insight as a variable in a formula rather than a quality. The lecture building scholars were trying to quantify transcendence. The spider creatures in the lecture building, small spiderlings, spawn from specific ceiling panels and have a patrol range limited to those panels. They do not follow the player outside their spawn area. They are guarding something at the ceiling level, not hunting on the floor level. The item description for the Augur of Ebrietas, a lecture building area arcane tool, describes Ebrietas as a being left behind, not trapped, not imprisoned, left behind. The Great One, called Ebrietas, was intended to leave with others of her kind, and was not taken. She stayed in Yharnam because no one came for her. The Nightmare Frontier's ground texture, under close inspection, is made up of a repetitive organic pattern that does not correspond to any geological formation. The ground of the Nightmare Frontier is not rock or earth. It is a biological surface, something that looks like compressed tissue at a scale too large to register as biological, unless you are looking specifically for it. The terrain of the Nightmare Frontier has gravity that is inconsistent with a standard environment. Some sections allow rolling attacks that travel further than the same roll in other areas. Other sections feel slower. The inconsistency is not random. It correlates to proximity to the amygdala's resting position. The amygdala's presence is distorting the physics of the space around it. The insight cost to enter the Nightmare Frontier via the item is 2 points. 2 is the lowest non-zero cost for Nightmare entry in the game. The Nightmare Frontier is the most accessible of the nightmares, the least demanding in terms of the price of entry. This accessibility is intentional design. The Nightmare Frontier was intended to be reachable, and its relative openness implies it was created for a purpose that required broad access. The item description for pebbles. The simplest throwing item says they can be used to distract enemies. In the Nightmare Frontier, throwing a pebble at certain enemies does not distract them. They track the pebble's source perfectly and orient immediately toward the player. The enemies of the Nightmare Frontier process spatial information differently from other game areas. The amygdala in the Nightmare Frontier, once defeated, does not disappear. It collapses and remains. Like the cleric beast, it stays in the space. The Nightmare Frontier's amygdala occupies the arena as a physical object after its death, and if you return, the body is positioned differently than where it fell. The body has moved posthumously. The 3 items placed near the Nightmare Frontier's outer edge, accessible only by navigating the most dangerous outer path, have descriptions that, read in the order you encounter them on that path, form a 3-sentence statement about the nature of arcane inheritance. The statement is split across 3 item descriptions that individually seem unrelated. The spectral summon, available for the amygdala fight in the Nightmare Frontier, is unique. It is the only spectral summon in the game whose character model does not match any existing NPC archetype. It is a figure in clothing that does not belong to any faction in the game. The summon is a mystery without context. The wind in the Nightmare Frontier blows in 2 directions simultaneously at the boundary between the main open area and the cliffside section. Audio analysis shows 2 separate wind audio tracks playing together at the zone boundary, each originating from a different direction. The boundary between these 2 wind systems marks where the nightmare's physical coherence begins to break down. The exit point of the Nightmare Frontier, the way back to the main game via lamp, places you in the Cathedral Ward. But the Nightmare Frontier is not physically near the Cathedral Ward in the game's internal geography. The lamp connection is not spatial. It is something else connecting these 2 places, and the game never specifies what. The pacing of enemy encounters in the Nightmare Frontier is specifically designed to isolate the player. The enemy placement ensures you are never fighting 2 groups simultaneously, but always have another group visible while fighting one. The space keeps you in constant awareness of threats you are not yet facing. This is architectural anxiety, built into the encounter design. The Nightmare Frontier item that reduces arcane damage when worn. The Arcane Lake rune has a description specific to the Nightmare context. It says the rune draws from the wisdom of the great hunters. Hunters, plural. In a space that appears to have had no great hunters present. The Nightmare Frontier absorbed someone else's history. The pungent blood cocktail works better in the Nightmare Frontier than anywhere else in the base game. Enemies respond to it across a longer range, and the response duration is extended. This suggests the beasts of the Nightmare Frontier have a heightened blood sensitivity, that their relationship to blood is more fundamental than that of the beasts in Yharnam's physical streets. Chapter 9, Cainhurst Castle. Blood, aristocracy, and the vile blood covenant. Cainhurst is Bloodborne's Gothic castle set-piece, and it is also the game's clearest statement about class and blood purity. The vile bloods of Cainhurst were aristocrats who found a different source of blood than the healing church, one that the church labelled impure and subsequently destroyed. The castle is the ruin of their civilization, and understanding its history changes everything about the execution of faction and Alfred's Ark. The carriage that takes you to Cainhurst uses a path that does not exist on the normal geography of Yharnam. The road to Cainhurst is a phantom road, a route that requires a specific invitation to materialize. The carriage is not a real carriage traveling a real road. It is a mechanism for crossing a gap in physical reality. The bloodstains in Cainhurst, and there are many, have a different quality than bloodstains in Yharnam. They are older, more oxidized, and in some cases have crystallized into structures. The blood here has been sitting for so long, it has become mineral. The Cainhurst enemies, the spectral castle servants, are not ghosts in the traditional sense. They are echoes. They are replaying actions from a specific point in the castle's past, the night of the massacre. Every spectral enemy in Cainhurst is doing what they were doing at the moment they died. The dining hall of Cainhurst Castle contains place settings for a meal that was interrupted. The food on the plates has not decayed. It has crystallized, like the blood. Time in Cainhurst has not moved normally since the massacre. The item description for Annalise's blood cocktails, offerings made to her, describes her as having a quality of blood that the church could not synthesize. The vile blood lineage had a biological difference, not just a philosophical one. Their blood was genuinely different in kind, not just in source. Queen Annalise, seated on her throne and apparently immortal, has a line of dialogue that implies she has been sitting on that throne since the massacre. She did not survive the attack and then rebuild. She survived the attack and did not move. She has been in that room, in that chair, for what the game's internal timeline suggests as many decades. The Ligarius boss fight occurs at the highest point of the castle, on a rooftop accessible only by climbing over the castle's exterior. Ligarius chose the most exposed, most visible location on the castle to make his stand. He is not guarding the interior. He is guarding the sky above the castle, making himself visible from a great distance, as a warning. The moon rune, obtained from Annalise as a covenant reward, is described as belonging to a great one, associated with bloodlines and inheritance. The vile blood covenant's connection to a great one of inherited blood suggests the vile blood lineage was not a corruption but a continuation, a biological legacy of a much older relationship between humanity and something cosmic. Ligarius's mask, wearable by the player, has a different description depending on whether you completed Alfred's questline before or after visiting Cainhurst. The description changes in a single word. Lost becomes taken. The change is only visible if you read the description both times, and most players do not. The architectural details of Cainhurst, specifically the stonework around the castle's upper windows, use a decorative style called grotesque masonry that historically was used to ward off supernatural influence by depicting it. Cainhurst's decorative monsters are not aesthetic choices. They are protective wards built by people who knew what they were protecting against. The Cainhurst Vileblood's relationship with the Healing Church is framed as purely antagonistic. The church attacked the castle, killed the inhabitants, and outlawed the lineage. But the arcane design of the equipment found in Cainhurst shares specific elements with church arcane tools. At some point, the church and Cainhurst were sharing knowledge. The antagonism came after a period of collaboration. The ghost enemies of Cainhurst have different attack patterns, depending on whether you killed Annalise before or after entering the main hall. Their aggression level shifts based on her status in a way that suggests they are aware of her condition, even in their spectral echo state. The telescope found near the castle's observatory points had a specific star cluster visible from Cainhurst's latitude. The cluster was significant in medieval European astronomical tradition as a marker of royal lineage and divine right to rule. The Cainhurst astronomers were studying the stars for justification of their queen's authority, not scientific knowledge. Alfred's final fate, if you complete his questline, takes place in Cainhurst. He kills Annalise and crushes her remains. The game's title card for him, at this point, changes his epithet. He goes from being a hunter of the Healing Church to a single-word identifier that the game will not let you translate, but displays in the game's arcane script. The script translates to a word meaning finished, with ambiguity about whether finished means completed or ended. The item description for the Cainhurst set, the armor worn by Cainhurst knights, notes that the silver of the armor serves a function beyond decoration. The specific composition of the silver alloy is described in terms that match the formulation of silver preparations used historically in early surgery as antimicrobial agents. The Cainhurst knights were wearing medical-grade silver alloy. The bloodstained messenger enemies in Cainhurst are wearing items from the Cainhurst household that they should not have access to. Items from areas of the castle accessible only to the family. The messengers are not new arrivals. They were in Cainhurst before the massacre and have been moving through the castle freely since. The portrait gallery in Cainhurst contains paintings of individuals in chronological order. You can determine the order from the clothing style changes. At the end of the portrait gallery, the final portrait is covered by a cloth. The covered portrait is the same dimensions as the others in the series and appears to have been covered from outside the portrait frame. The cloth is anchored to the wall, not to the painting. Someone outside the portrait decided to cover it. The sound design of Cainhurst Castle includes, in the quietest portions of the building, the sound of a harpsichord playing a melody at a very low volume. The melody is not random. It is a theme that appears in the main game's soundtrack in a different instrumentation in the menu screen, suggesting Cainhurst's music predates the current game's setting. The numbing mist, found in abundance in the upper floors of Cainhurst, is more concentrated than what is found elsewhere. A higher grade preparation. Cainhurst's residents were dealing with something that required stronger arcane suppression than the standard preparation could provide. The staircase in Cainhurst's central tower spirals in the opposite direction from the staircases in cathedral ward buildings. In real-world historical construction, the direction of staircase spiral was sometimes standardized within a cultural tradition, specifically related to defense and the dominant hand of the defenders. Cainhurst's staircases are built for left-handed defense. The cathedral wards are built for right-handed defense. Different cultures built these. The gargoyle-like figures on Cainhurst's parapets are not gargoyles. They are figures in full armour, rendered in the same stone as the building, in poses of standing watch. These are people who became stone while standing guard. The castle's defenders did not flee. They are still there, fixed in the stone of their final positions. The Cainhurst bloodletter enemies, the blood-drinking spectral nobles, only attack the player when approached beyond a specific proximity. Within a certain distance, they ignore the player entirely. The distance is exactly the social distance a servant would maintain from a noble in formal protocol. The spectral nobles are not hunting, they are attending a reception. The blood pond in the Cainhurst basement, accessed through a hidden passage most players never find, contains an item at its centre that requires swimming to reach. The game does not have a swimming mechanic. Reaching the item requires specific movement and a willingness to take damage continuously from the blood. The item's description says it belonged to Ligarius before his self-imposed guard duty. He came down here before he went up to the roof. Chapter 10. Nightmare of Mensis. The Brain, the Murgo, and the Mikolash encounter. The Nightmare of Mensis is the game's deepest descent into the purely cosmic, and it contains the densest concentration of lore-significant details in the base game. The School of Mensis, the organization that built and operates this nightmare space, did so by sacrificing themselves. They gave up their own minds. The iron helmets worn by the Mensis scholars are not protecting their heads from outside harm. They are containing what was left after the information arrived. Mikolash, host of the Nightmare, is one of the most discussed NPCs in Bloodborne's community, and most of that discussion centers on his quotes. But the less discussed detail is his physical state. Mikolash is alive in the Nightmare in a way that other Nightmare denizens are not. He has retained his body, his voice, his identity. Whatever the Mensis ritual did to the others, Mikolash's outcome was different. He got something the others did not. The phrase, "grant us eyes." Mikolash's most famous line is a request, not a prayer. The phrasing is petitionary, but addressed to something that could grant the request. Mikolash is talking to someone who is present when he says it. He knows you are there, and he is using you as an intermediary. The brain in the Nightmare of Mensis, the enormous exposed brain that strikes the player with frenzy from a distance, is described in item lore as having awareness. The brain does not have a body. It does not have limbs. Its entire existence is perception and projection. It is a mind that became so large, it became an organ of pure thought. If you lower the brain to the underground section and then return to it, it has moved, not in a scripted cutscene, not as a game event. It simply occupies a different position than it was in before you lowered it. The brain navigated independently, in a space where there was nothing to navigate toward while you were away. The Murgo's wet nurse boss, a massive entity caring for the invisible, crying infant, has a behavior that reads differently once you understand what she is. She is not a guardian in the aggressive sense. Her attack patterns, when analyzed, are consistently intercept-based. She places herself between the player and the center of the arena, between you and Murgo. She is trying to keep you away from something she is protecting, not simply trying to kill you. The crying of Murgo, audible but sourceless throughout the area, does not stop after you defeat the wet nurse. It continues. Only after Gehrman's story arc resolves does the crying stop, which one reading takes to mean that Murgo's fate is tied not to the defeat of her guardian, but to the resolution of the dreaming cycle. The School of Mensis had communication with the Great Ones via the nightmare. Their ritual connected Yharnam's nightmare to a cosmic space and gave them access to information that should have been inaccessible to humans. But the information they received was not organized or presented in a form they could understand without losing themselves. The iron helmets contain what was left after the information arrived. The specific arrangement of candles in Mikolash's final room, before his last phase, forms a pattern that matches the School of Mensis's insignia. He arranged them himself, in a maze that he has been running through for what the game implies is a very long time. Mikolash has maintained a religious space. He has not given up ritual. The two-phase chase section, with Mikolash as the game's only extended chase sequence. The design of the maze forces repeated loop patterns. Mikolash knows this maze perfectly, and you do not. He is running loops he has run before, while you are navigating them for the first time. Every time you catch up to him, it is because he let you. The Nightmare of Mensis's exterior, the section before the main building, contains large birds that are not aggressive unless provoked. The birds are larger than any bird species visible in the main game, and are perched on the architecture of the nightmare in a way that suggests they are endemic to this space, not transported here from Yharnam. The nightmare has its own ecology. Murgo's loft, the tower-like structure at the center of the nightmare, has more floors than make geometric sense for its exterior height. The interior is larger than the outside. This spatial impossibility is not glitched. It is consistent throughout the area. The loft extends further upward inside than the building's exterior height would permit. The item dropped by the brain when it is interacted with in its lowered position, the living string, is described as having come from a damaged Great One. The brain is a damaged Great One, reduced from a full being to a floating organ. What was the rest of the Great One whose brain you are now carrying? The choir intelligencer enemies in the Nightmare of Mensis have a specific behavior when they spot the player from a distance. Instead of immediately charging, they raise their right hand for exactly 3 seconds before moving. The gesture is the same gesture used by healing church figures in the cathedral ward to initiate blood-taking procedures. The choir is treating combat as a medical procedure. The main hall of the Nightmare of Mensis contains an astronomical clock, a large mechanical display showing celestial positions. The clock is running, and the positions it displays are not consistent with the positions of stars visible from Yharnam. The clock is tracking a different sky, one that cannot be seen from the physical world. The number of doors in the Nightmare of Mensis maze that are sealed but have handles is 7. 7 sealed doors in a maze where Mikolash has been for a very long time. The sealed doors are not there because they were never opened. They were sealed specifically. 7 rooms in this maze were closed deliberately by someone who knew where they were. The music that plays during the Murgo's wet nurse fight contains a lullaby melody in its secondary layer. A lullaby playing beneath the combat music of a boss fight. The lullaby is not complete. It loops at a point before its natural end, as though the singer never got to finish it. Chapter 11. The Hunter's Dream. Secrets of the Safe Place. The Hunter's Dream is presented as a sanctuary, the one safe space in the game's world. But almost every detail of the dream, examined closely, points toward it being something other than what it presents itself as. The doll's role in the dream is to channel power, to take the blood echoes you bring and convert them into personal development. But the description of how she does this is passive in the original Japanese. She is not the source of the power. She is a medium for something the dream itself contains. The doll is an interface, not a power source. Gehrman's wheelchair is positioned at a specific angle relative to the workshop's primary window. From that angle, the one thing consistently visible outside the window is the moon presence's silhouette during the endgame. The window frames what Gehrman has been looking at, and the moon presence has been there the entire game. The workshop tools in the Hunter's Dream are not worn. Every other workshop in the game, the Healing Church workshop, the workshop in Old Yharnam, has tools that show wear from heavy use. The Dream's tools are pristine. They have never been used, or they are reset between uses, which one possible reading suggests the dream does not allow consequences to accumulate in its physical space. The Garden of the Hunter's Dream. The small garden area around the workshop contains only plants that in Victorian botanical tradition were associated with death, mourning, and boundaries between worlds. Cypress, yew, and a specific fern that historically grew in places associated with burial. The garden was not assembled casually. The music of the Hunter's Dream is in a specific key, F minor, that is associated in Western classical tradition with struggle, despair, and deep anguish. The safe space of the game is in the key of suffering. The composers chose this. Gehrman speaks to you as an equal in some of his dialogue, and as a child in others. The inconsistency is intentional. He is either uncertain of your relationship, or he is playing two roles simultaneously, the compassionate mentor and the reluctant jailer, and sometimes one leaks into the other. The old workshop collapsed within the dream, visible below a gap in the floorboards, is accessible via the old abandoned workshop in the main game. The two spaces are connected by a physical link in the dream, and the abandoned workshop's version of the dream appears to be an older iteration, a previous version of the same space. The dream has existed before in a different form. The messengers, the small figures that worship the player and carry items, have teeth marks on their fingers, not bite marks from outside. Their own teeth marks, they have been putting their own fingers in their mouths. The lantern, outside the Hunter's Dream workshop, is not a Yharnam lantern. Its design predates the Yharnam lamp designs by a significant period based on the styling. The dream was built around something older than Yharnam. The moon presence, when it appears at the final boss encounter, arrives from above, descending. It does not emerge from within the dream. It comes from outside the dream space, which means the moon presence is not the dream. It is something that visits the dream. Gehrman is not the moon presence's servant in a building the moon presence owns. He is a prisoner in a building the moon presence controls, but does not inhabit. The doll's hair is the same colour as Gehrman's in the old photograph found in the old abandoned workshop. This could be coincidence, or it could suggest Gehrman modelled the doll on a specific person whose hair matched his own, which narrows the possible identities of who the doll represents. The Hunter's Dream has no weather. The main game has dynamic weather. Fog, mist, wind, changes in atmospheric density. The dream has none of this. The dream's atmosphere is completely stable and unchanging, which is not how dreams normally work, but is how a controlled environment would work. The ladder in the Hunter's Dream that leads to Gehrman's sleeping area has an unusual property. It is the only ladder in the game that the player cannot climb from the top down. You can go up it, but you cannot reverse course on it. Once you start climbing toward Gehrman's area, the only way back is to drop off the side. The specific flowers in the Hunter's Dream garden appear in different growth stages each time you visit. Some more open, some more closed. The flowers are on a growth cycle independent of the game's night cycle. The dream is experiencing its own separate passage of time, slower than Yharnam's night, but real in its own way. Gehrman's spoken lines, in the Japanese version, include a specific phrase addressed to Maria, the person the doll is modelled on. that he says, in a state somewhere between waking and sleeping when you approach him early in the game. He is not addressing you. He is speaking to someone who is not there in a language that carries grief very clearly, even without translation. The workshop's interior, in the hunter's dream, has a second door that is always closed and cannot be opened by the player. It is not sealed. There is no lock visible, no beam, no mechanism to explain why it will not open. The door simply does not respond to interaction. Whatever is behind it, the dream has decided you are not meant to see it. The blood residue visible on Gehrman's scythe, the burial blade before it is obtained by the player, is a specific dark colour that does not match any blood variety in the main game. The blood on Gehrman's weapon is not from Yharnam. It is from somewhere or something else. The hunter's dream ends. When you reach a specific story point, the music changes. A chord plays that was never in the dream's music before. It is the chord that signals, in the game's musical language, a transition. The dream is aware that something has changed. It prepares. The doll's sewing in the hunter's dream, if you follow what she is making across multiple visits, shows progressive completion. She is not randomly sewing. She is making something specific, and it gets more complete the further you progress in the game. She finishes it before the ending. The hunter's dream is the most visited location in the game for most players. You return there more times than any other single area. And yet the details that change across visits, the flowers, the doll's project, Gehrman's dialogue states, are subtle enough that most players do not register the dream as a space that changes. They see it as a constant. It is not. Chapter 12, The Old Hunters DLC. The true history of the hunt, the Old Hunters DLC, is the portion of Bloodborne most likely to reframe everything you thought you knew about the base game's story, and I chose to save it for a dedicated chapter because its revelations deserve room. The Hunter's Nightmare is a space created specifically to contain the Old Hunters, the first generation of Yharnam's beast hunters, and prevent their stories from affecting the present. Someone made a decision to erase the history of the hunt, and the nightmare is that erasure made physical. Ludwig the Holy Blade, a major DLC boss, was not based on his lore, a human who became a beast. He was a horse who was given blood and became something that could wield weapons. The Healing Church's first significant hunter was not a person. The history of the hunt begins with an animal that was elevated. Ludwig's cry of, "My fellow hunters, can you hear my call?" during his second phase, when he recovers some sense of self, is one of the most emotionally discussed moments in the game. But the detail that makes it stranger is what he says immediately after regaining his head's focus on the Holy Moonlight Sword. He asks if it was all a dream. The nightmare has been his entire reality for so long that recognizing a real object feels like waking up. Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower is one of the few enemies in the game who is definitively human at the point of the fight. She chose to remain in the nightmare rather than return to Yharnam. Her weapon, the Rakuyo,